Hello, nice to see you. We are here to discuss about the book of Khanna, Polish edition of his famous book Konektografii, in Polish title Konektografia, mapowanie przyszłości cywilizacji globalnej. In 1298, in prison cell, what is a little bit funny, Marco Polo wrote one of the most famous world global book, The Description of the World. In that context, Khanna wrote his book, which is he went further with the ideas of Marco Polo to describe the world, describe the global world. First of all, Parag, could you tell us a few words about your book? Why do you think it should be also published in Polish?
Well, thank you so much. I'm very grateful that the book has been published in Polish, and I think the timing probably could not be better given the difficulties, the challenges, but also the opportunities. And so I want to thank you so much for organizing this event and inviting me to join. I've been to Poland quite a few times, actually, so I don't feel that I'm an expert on Poland, but I certainly have an appreciation of Poland. I've driven and crisscrossed the country numerous times, north, south, east, west, over the last 20 years. Now, let's talk about connectography. I'm a student of geopolitics, and geopolitics, simply defined, is the relationship between power and space. And I wanted to introduce or reintroduce the variable of connectivity. Now, connectivity has always been an instrument of power projection. That connectivity has taken the form of roads, of railways, of military bases, of military installations, bases, and equipment, and so on and so forth. And now it takes the form of more and more dense networks of fixed infrastructure. And I broke those infrastructures into three categories: transportation, energy, and communications. And if you look at the layers of these infrastructures, transportation, energy, and communications, and their build out over time, especially the last 75, 100 years, it's incredible. It really wraps the planet in this connectivity. And this connectivity is far, far, far longer than all of the borders in the world combined. But at the same time, we have more borders than ever before. So we have this interesting paradox: a world that is more politically divided than ever before, but a world that is more infrastructurally connected than ever before. Now, those are not just rhetorical statements and not literary statements. Those are empirical facts. Those are measurable facts. You measure the length of borders. You count the number of countries. We have more than ever before. You measure the length of pipelines and railways and roads and highways and internet cables, and it is far more than ever before. So you do have a genuine paradox of connectivity and division. And so the purpose of this book was to explore that relationship in the context of the overall evolution of geopolitics. And I made some conclusions, that connectivity, that power in many ways is a function of connectivity, the degree of connectivity. If this were the 19th century, we would say size, material size, territorial size, population size, and so forth are key determinants of power. They still are very important determinants of power. But the degree of connectivity, which is to say the extensity and the density of relations between yourself and many other nodes around the world, whether they are nations or cities, can matter as much or more. So small nations that have extensive connectivity can punch above their weight, as the saying goes. And so I focus a lot in this book on cities. I look at cities like Singapore or Dubai, and I look at how they have this power that is far larger than their size or their population. Why is that? It's a function, of course, of the degree of their connectivity. It's the connectivity that they have in the financial system. It's the assets that they own internationally through capital markets. It's the foreign investment and trade. It's their role as hubs and logistics networks, and so on and so forth. So power as a function of connectivity is one conclusion. The other is that cities can play roles as important as states. Now, this should not be surprising because cities are our enduring social political unit. We have had cities for 7,000 years. We've had states for only a couple of hundred years. So the fact is that there is no great state, no great nation without great cities. It is the state that depends on the city more than the city depending on the state. And this is something that people have gotten backwards for centuries of analysis. It really does come down. And a great empire is a collection of cities, a collection of megacities. One of the things I describe in the chapter on China is that China is an empire of megacities. Now let's get to the geopolitical part, where I say effectively, connectivity is a force projection, a power projection instrument, as it always has been, from the Romans to the Ottomans to the Russian Empire to the British Empire, and so forth. So connectivity as a force multiplier and power projection. So this contradicts the notion that all connectivity, all interdependence, all globalization is good. I've always argued since my very first book that globalization is an imperial enterprise. Globalization that we think of today as this world of borderless integration and connectivity and so forth results from imperial expansion, right? Whether it is the British Empire, whether it's the American Empire, and whether or not it is also today China's model of globalization, the Belt and Road Initiative, China's trade networks, all of that is competitive globalization. It is Chinese neo-mercantilism. Chinese mercantilism is Chinese globalization. And now we don't have one globalization. We have American globalization, European globalization, Chinese globalization, and all of that self-serving and imperially oriented globalization results in an ever greater volume of connectivity. It may be for geopolitical purposes, but it adds up to a whole that is greater than the sum of its parts. So you take a systemic view, a top-down view, a complexity view, and you see all of this activity. China is investing in the Arctic and in the Antarctic and building railways here and there and buying up ports and protecting its supply chains with its military and developing oil and gas fields and launching satellites. And India is doing the same. And Europe is promoting its codes of conduct and trade standards. And America, of course, is signing new trade agreements, and Europe is as well, and so forth. All of that is in one's own interest. Europe does things in its interest. America does things in its interest. China does things in its interest. But it leaves behind an infrastructure. It adds to the accumulating volume of global connectivity. And that connectivity historically outlasts the creator, right? We have roads, railways, pipelines that predate the nations through which they pass. And even when the country is gone or destroyed, we still have the infrastructure. I served in Iraq and Afghanistan in the United States Department of Defense for some time during 2007, 2008, during the height of combat operations in those countries. And now I look back more than 10 years later, and of course, America's military presence is almost gone, but the bases remain, the infrastructure remains. And this is always the case, of course, around the world. The British Empire is gone from India, but the railways remain. And so infrastructure changes its role, changes its hands over time, but it is still there. And so I look at examples of how infrastructure today has been used and can be used as a weapon. And I talk about connectivity as a battlefield. I look, for example, at the role of connectivity between Saudi Arabia and Bahrain. They built a bridge. It was called the Friendship Bridge. But then what happened during the Arab Spring? Saudi Arabia rolled tanks over this bridge and wound up ineffectively subduing, if you will, unrest in Bahrain. And then, of course, I look at Ukraine, and maybe that's a good place to wind up. In this book, I had the benefit. I've traveled to Ukraine numerous times. I wrote about the way in which, in 2014, Russia laid mines across the isthmus connecting Ukraine to Crimea, effectively severing it, and then how it completed the bridge over the Strait of Kerch. And I called this the bridge, of course, that was recently attacked. And I called this a geopolitical amputation, right? A geopolitical amputation. The world is a body, right? The terrestrial area of the world is like a body. And we physically modify it through topographical engineering. Building infrastructure in military terminology is known as topographical engineering. And we are obviously always engineering the topography of the world to suit our strategic objectives. And so the annexation of Crimea and the completion of the bridge was a geopolitical amputation from Crimea and an annexation by Russia. And this kind of thing is happening around the world. This is what China is doing with Belt and Road projects. And of course, I conclude with the internet. And I look at the role of the internet and internet cables and that connectivity. And I say there are two kinds of geopolitics when it comes to the internet. There's the geopolitics of the internet, which is, of course, the geography of internet cables and data servers. Countries want to have them onshore. They want to control the physical infrastructure. They want to avoid it being hacked or destroyed or cut off, right? There's a physical internet geography. Now it's also satellites and control of satellites and encryption of those satellites. Then there's the geopolitics in the internet, which is, of course, cyber attacks, cyber warfare, data theft, hacking, all of those kinds of things. So for every kind of connectivity, there is a geopolitics and a power dynamics associated with it. And the world has become a more fluid competition than ever before between imperial powers, nation states, city states, corporations, and private stateless actors and groups, such as cyber hacking communities, terrorist groups, and these kinds of things. And so there's a typology that I create within this framework of a global network civilization in which there are empires, regional groupings, nation states, cities, and what I call cloud communities, right? That could be Anonymous, the hacker group, or whatever the case may be, or diasporas and so on. And this is the reality of our complex civilization, is this ever more connected network in which we're competing over connectivity as much as we are competing over geography. And so I'll just bring it back to Europe, of course. You know, you are the front lines, and in the I have an entire chapter about the European pipeline, oil and gas pipeline network. And I look at the relationship between borders, energy infrastructure, dependence on Russia, and diversification. And I point out that, you know, with the increased investment that Europe has been making in energy diversification geographically and in terms of the types of resources, that Europe could accelerate its process of self-sufficiency from Russia, which it, of course, has now made it a strategic objective to do and is succeeding at doing in a number of ways through greater connectivity in other directions. And so the final point is that resilience, a very idea of resilience, systemic resilience, actually results from more connectivity. And I'll give you a simple example. If you are a country with one internet cable and that cable gets cut, like North Korea, you lose your internet access. Now, Singapore, where I live, is much smaller than North Korea, but it has about 35 internet cables. It is the most open economy in the world, the most connected airport and society in the entire world. A tiny little country has 30 internet cables. You could cut 25 of them. We would all still have our internet access, right? So there's resilience. It is also the most food import dependent country in the world and the most energy import dependent country in the world. So Singapore gets gas from 5 different countries and imports food from 25 different countries. During COVID, there was a situation where Malaysia, which is the largest neighbor food provider for Singapore, cut off the export of chickens. They needed their chickens, but I was still able to eat chicken the next day because Singapore gets its chickens from so many other places. So now that's just one example. But if you bring it back to the high level of global infrastructure, I said, if you look at China's Belt and Road, of course, China is doing it for its own purposes, right? How can we more easily access resources? How can we more rapidly export, right? How can we have alternative pathways and send ships over the Arctic so we don't have to be beholden to the Malacca trap of ships through the Straits of Malacca and across the Indian Ocean through the Suez Canal? How can we have more Eurasian transportation networks like railways and pipelines? And so they're building all of that for themselves. But in the end, it actually creates more systemic resilience, because if you have a situation where the Suez Canal is blocked, everyone can use those other routes. And that leads to a system where you have fewer points of failure, fewer single points of failure, fewer blockages in the system. And so there's this dynamic. The biggest picture dynamic is really between self-serving nature of infrastructure as an imperial tool versus the overall systemic resilience that it creates, because it fundamentally creates more pathways for A to connect to B, for supply to connect to demand. And that is, in a brief kind of overview, the overall message of Konektography. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this inspiring introduction, Parag. Unfortunately, Parag has around 40 minutes for us to discuss all these phases. So let's start quick with the round of answer, the round of comments. Małgorzata Bonikowska, President of Center of International Relations in Warsaw. Małgorzata, generally speaking, as Parag says, this globalization is irreversible. The connectivity stays with us for all the time. But in the same, let's put it, we had a real tests of what developments in last years. I'm talking about pandemic and breakup of supply chains in the world. Right now, we are during war, which is destroying Ukraine, but it's also destroying European and world economy. Do you really think that globalization is irreversible as well?
Well, first of all, let me congratulate Parag for this wonderful book. I think it's really worth reading. It's a long one, but it's very, very stimulating, and I think it adds to our current debate. So congratulations, really. It's a huge work you've done. And I also appreciate the fact that you are doing it not only on the basis on your reading and desk research and talks, but also on your own travels and, meeting people on place and just interacting with them in these places you have been describing. So that's also a very strong value. Well, having said that, I have several comments and maybe some questions as well to you. First of all, the book was written, the original in English was written in 2016. So this was the time after Crimea, 2014, but still far before what we have now, this kind of feeling that, it's very much instability everywhere. This was before not only the invasion on Ukraine by Russia, but it was also even before pandemic. So this would be my comment, but also question. Maybe you have some comments to your own book after these events. But the comments will be that, of course, this changed the perception of what's happening in the world. From our point of view, especially looking, at the globe from Central Eastern Europe, or especially the EU Eastern flank, or as we say, Eastern Front even, we have to signal that certain things definitely are changing, have been changing for a while. For example, you mentioned, Agaton, about deglobalization as a consequence. Well, I do think maybe it's not about deglobalization, as also Parag argues, but regionalization. What we can observe is definitely that the supply chains are now, the business is really watching, it's really analyzing and taking decisions not only on the basis of costs, but also on a basis of political risk, the distance, and the feeling that the business wants to be independent from too much of dependence. Not only from one supplier, but also from one place, such as China or India, like we've discovered the dependence in the EU on pharmaceuticals, right? So this feeling that we want to be really more independent in the sense of being self-sustainable, it is now really very much felt in Europe, and especially in the EU. It's about everything now, from food, where we are successfully independent, self-sustainable. So we are not really afraid of the consequences of the war and all the problem with Ukraine and Russia as providers of grain. We are self-sustainable in the EU, but there are many other actors who are not. So I think these fears, these kind of thinking, it's very much true when we look at the business who makes decisions. Not all of these decisions are still made, but the reflection is going on. So the supply chains will be shorter and some production will definitely be moved. not necessarily to our own countries, respective countries, but in the neighborhood, most likely. It does not mean that some of the production will not stay in, let's say, Asia, but not necessarily in China. So there will be a lot to observe. But the same goes to the states, independent states, and also to the EU as an organization, this feeling of being much more self-sustainable. A little bit, we are feeling all more afraid. So that's one comment. Second comment is about, you think about this globalization, meaning huge, really, agreements. You mentioned TTIP, you mentioned TTP. Well, we know what happened after the book was written. TTP, the US withdrawn. TTIP was not finished, and it's very difficult to imagine that we are able to come back to this kind of vision between the US and Europe, which is a paradox that these two, let's say, historical friends trade and have a lot of interaction economically, but we don't have any free trade agreement between us. So there is a consequence because of political decisions. So I would argue that this political factor about policy making, about especially politics, and especially about some individuals. I mentioned Trump, but we can mention many more political leaders that they may have much more to say that you expect. Sometimes it doesn't need to be logical and doesn't need to be rational. But such as Putin, this wasn't really, from our point of view, a rational decision, but he made it. So from this perspective, and that's I end here, we may expect some politicians, some political decisions which could destroy this beautiful vision you are having.
Thank you very much, Małgorzata. And Jacek Bartosiak, the founder and CEO of think tank Strategy and Future, the author of several books about geopolitics. Małgorzata just said, but the politics is back. Maybe it's something deeper. As I understand Parag well, in his book he wrote, we are the prisoners of geography. I think it's a synonym for geopolitics. Jacek, in your opinion, are we still the prisoners of geography? We are still Marco Polo in its prison cell writing a book description of the world? Or on the contrary, that globalization is changing the rules? How, in your opinion, this tension between globalization and geopolitics look like? It's only politics is back, or maybe it's deeper. Geopolitics rules are as important as ever, or on the contrary, globalization is changing everything.
Okay, thank you for the inviting me over to speak on such a distinguished panel, including Dr. Parag Khanna, whose book I read a few years ago, and it impressed me, I must say. And current events, this tension between the United States and China and all resulting matters, including war in Ukraine, actually, in a way, have confirmed all major observations from the Parag Khanna's book. And basically, myself as a student of geopolitics, I found certain things in your book, Parag, very inspiring. Apparently, it was a good segue from Mackinder's teachings from 100 years ago towards the 21st century with a dense network of connectivity. Myself at Strategy and Future, we use a very similar concept of strategic flows that underpin the structure of relations between nations and empires and great powers, as you duly described. So your Konektography was a major intellectual, so to speak, aid to shape my own, ideas about how the world operates in the 21st century. So I got on your question, basically, is not the proper one, if I may say, because what Parag has just said and wrote in the book, that this is reality. Geopolitics is reality, and this reality is reflected in Konektography, in this connectivity between people using infrastructure. Especially, Barak was stressing the importance of growing capabilities of humanity to build infrastructure on land, on the continent, as opposed to the last 500 years of the maritime domination of the sea powers. And without going deep into discussing the book itself, which I highly recommend as a very modern approach of all teachings of Mackinder, which in my opinion have not lost meaning at all, and Barak is reconfirming this attitude. I just want to ask Barak the following question. Not only in this book, but in your other books, also in your speeches, which I have been following closely, you were the advocate of the ever closer globalization, ever expanding globalization, that this is inevitable. And as we all know, United States is trying not to agree with you, so to speak. And also I sensed, and please confirm, maybe I'm wrong, that you felt that the consolidation of Eurasia is inevitable because of China, because of technology, because you can defeat a little bit, shape geography by infrastructure. And the structural forces of Eurasian consolidation will be more powerful than this desire of the sea powers to using the Wallerstein's concept of core areas and peripheries to sustain the system that was with us for the last 500 years. And I felt this tension in your works, because you and maybe I'm wrong, were of the opinion that continental consolidation is inevitable, with the consequences for the United States power in the world and so on. And this is critically important for Poland and critically important for Europe during war in Ukraine. So am I reading you properly? And have you changed your mind, or maybe Eurasian continental consolidation is not inevitable because the United States managed to break it, or managed to create the impediment, and the deglobalization might also occur as it occurred prior to started occurring prior to the First World War, with all consequences. Interested in hearing from Barak, from our guest, what he thinks about it, and in this way how he sees the future in the context of this tension. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We will come back to Barak in a moment, but first, Paweł Śliwowski, Deputy Director of the Polish Economic Institute in Warsaw. Paweł, we are talking about connectivity. The connectivity is the king, as Barak says. Those who control connectivity control globalization. What is the role of a sovereign state in the process of globalization, in your opinion? Or maybe globalization is something, is a kind of zero-sum game, or globalization is an engine which is bigger than was just one or a few states? How do you see it?
I would would like to join my predecessors to congratulate Barak on a great book. Some of the theses you included in your chapters, I do really agree with. For example, when you emphasize several times that globalization and free trade have indeed improved the quality of life of millions, if not billions, of people around the world, and this is undisputable based on the economic data. And I also agree to some extent with this notion that probably the world will float toward Pax Urbanica, so to the state in which megacities, metropolis, do play a much more important role in comparison to the past. But returning back to Agaton's question, we for sure see today that states are not dead in terms of geopolitical or international trade relations. And in recent months, after the pandemics, in recent months after the war in Ukraine emerged, we see that states are taking back some control. So, for example, we are right now in the state of discussion about Inflation Reduction Act, which is being prepared and implemented in the United States. And this is right now a big discussion in Europe on how much will the implementation of these measures, which foresee that some of the supportive measures will only go to the products and companies which are US based, will tame the competitiveness of, for example, European companies. At the same time, we see the discussions around European Union about strategic autonomy, about nearshoring, about moving some of the part of the supply chains closer or to the countries in which the democracy is the ruling system and not the autocracy or tyranny. So for sure, we are seeing that states are not sleeping, let's say. They are not looking back from the back seat. They are now trying to gain some more control over the free trade. And this will be, of course, very interesting to hear what is the Parag's view about these new developments. And to conclude, my second question or my comment would be that still we see this connectivity, or what was several years ago coined as a term that the world is flat. So you can be anywhere in the world and you can reach the other way, the other part of the world. You can do anything you want thanks to the connectivity, thanks to the technology. But at the same time, what Parag is in some of parts of his book is showing, we see at the same time that the world is getting more and more concentrated to some extent. So, for example, these mega cities are getting more and more concentrated. Research shows that, for example, global patents, global research and development institutions are concentrating around these huge hubs. So to one extent, they are the byproduct of the global connected economy. But on the other side, geography, the location, the physical connectedness, physical proximity is still quite an important part. So I would also like to ask Parag about this kind of processes.
Thank you very much, Parag. So we have quick three questions to you from Małgorzata, from Jacek, and from Piotr. I will repeat what Małgorzata said about regionalization. It's not deglobalization, it's regionalization, but it's something a little bit in opposition to globalization. What is your comment on that? The question of Jacek about inevitable consolidation of Eurasia. Is it really inevitable? Are the United States able to block it? What will be the result of these tensions? And the question of Piotr about the rise of cities, about Pax Urbanica. What will be the consequence of that?
Excellent. Well, thank you. These are very, very astute and insightful comments. So let me respond to each of them. I'll take them in order for Dr. Małgorzatas' comments first on deglobalization. So I disagree with deglobalization as a thesis, because regionalism does not mean the end of globalization. In all of history, globalization is the result of regional consolidation. When a power, whether it is Britain in the 18th and 19th centuries or America in the 20th century, completes the domination of its region, it uses that as a foothold, as an anchor to expand. If you do not control your own domain, this goes back to the Spanish and the Portuguese as well. Only when you are stable in your region are you able to reach outward, right? That is literally all of human history. So right now in the popular culture, say, oh, we are nearshoring, we are turning inward, We have industrial policy. Everything will become local and national or regional again. It's the end of globalization. That is an incorrect logical arc, right? Yes, there is lots of nearshoring, lots of industrial policy, lots of regionalism going on, and I'm a very strong supporter of it. But it is a building block of globalization, not the reversal of globalization. And all of history proves this. Now, this ties into a number of other points. For example, you have mentioned TPP, TTIP, and you did not mention RCEP. But TPP, the Trump administration did not join, the Obama administration could not pass it, and the Biden administration has not passed it. But make no mistake, TPP exists. Every other country joined it. Japan, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Chile, Mexico, they are all want to host the summits and to expand the trade. Make no mistake that trans-Pacific trade is growing even if there is no TPP. And America right now is trying to create an Indo-Pacific Economic Partnership, IPEP, right? Which is its own version of a watered down TPP. So it doesn't matter if one politician or the next politician signs it or does not sign it. When you're talking about globalization, measure, use numbers. Did trade grow or did it not grow? That's what matters to globalization. Globalization doesn't care if Trump agreed or disagreed, if a law passed or did not pass. It's the result of the aggregated activity, right? It's a neutral, measurable concept. And that's just one example. Between the US and Europe, you already have had decades of free-ish trade. The fact that it's not growing that much has to do with regulatory frictions and competition over sectoral advantage. But it's still a huge amount of trade. The reason it's not growing is because the economies of the US and Europe are largely competitive in similar sectors, and because they're already very mature and their economies are growing slowly, not because there's a powerful anti-trade sentiment. Yes, there is that statement politically, but the fact is that the trade volume between the US and Europe has been relatively flat even before populists. So if we're being honest about causality, it's not that populist politicians cause a slowdown in trade between the US and Europe. This is a secular trend that has to do with economic structure and demographics and growth rates more than anything else, right? And then you did not mention RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. It is the largest trade agreement, regional trade agreement in the history of the world. And it came into effect this 1 year ago today, right? January of 2022. So how can we talk about globalization and trade and be pessimistic? It may be because, again, you are in Europe, or some people are talking about this in America. But I want to be very blunt. In Asia, 5 billion people, 5 billion with a B, don't really care about your opinion or Trump's opinion, right? They don't care at all. They are massively expanding trade. So how can anyone with a straight face say that trade is not expanding, globalization is not expanding, when in fact, the largest ever trade agreement has just gone into effect. And economists always underestimate the net impact of these agreements. And the biggest one has just signed. You didn't even mention it. Of course, you've underestimated its impact, which will be gigantic, gigantic. And of course, I live in Singapore. Chancellor Scholz of Germany just arrived in November last year with 3 plane loads of 1,000 German businessmen. I was sitting having beer with them. And they are very, very keen on pushing greater trade with Southeast Asia and with China, which is something that, of course, America opposes. So the reality is that you have more and more and more and more of this trade. Now, Trump is gone, and the United States has signed the US, Mexico, Canada trade agreement. Again, it's NAFTA plus. NAFTA was the 1994 agreement with Bill Clinton. Now you have NAFTA plus. You have more integration between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. You know that the United States trades more with Canada and trades more with Mexico than it does with China. So you have a deep expansion of regional trade. And guess what happens next? It's that they want to, again, expand internationally, right? Because What good is all of this nearshoring and industrial policy of production if you're limited to your own markets? That is true of Europe. That is true of North America. No one wants to be limited to their own domain. Your own markets in Europe are too small. North America is too small. Of course, once you do that consolidation and nearshoring and industrial policy, what people are calling deglobalization, you in fact have a massive expansion of globalization, because once you start making cars very cheaply in Mexico, and you're making them very cheaply in Slovakia and Hungary and so forth, the European market's not big enough. You say, hey, we want to sell into Asia. We want to sell into Africa. We want to sell into the Middle East. That's just the same thing that happens every single century. So I don't worry ever about the cumulative, aggregate, statistical fate of globalization. In every century, it grows and it grows and it grows and it grows, and it outlasts every populist politician. The populist politicians speak against globalization, and they always disappear in 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. And globalization just drives right over them. Let's look at the trade volume. Trade is back in a big way. The headlines of the Financial Times today says that there is a massive wave of capital and investment going into emerging markets because they are growing at 9%, 10%, right? So financial globalization, huge again. The volume of digital services trade and services, digital consulting, content, online advertising, you name it, right? Gaming, is now $5 trillion a year. The volume of all the goods trade in the world, everything that is put on ships and containers and sent around the world, is $6 trillion a year. Even if you stopped all the ships from sailing around the world, you have digital globalization, which will soon be greater than physical globalization, right? That's a fact. So, sure, politicians have a voice, but I want you to tell me the result. I want you to tell me the state of the numbers and tell me what matters more. And that applies in Europe too when you look at demographics. You have populist politicians who say, no more immigration. But the original globalization is migration. We have more migrants than ever before, whether we want them or don't want them, whether it's voluntary or involuntary, right? The fact is, measure it, and we have more and more and more. So this gets me to Mr. Jacek's point about, I'm not an advocate, actually, of globalization. I'm an analyst, right? I analyze first, I advocate second. And when you analyze globalization, everything I'm saying is just factually true. There are numbers to back it up. There is a clear trend line, and it's up and to the right, no matter what any politician says. Now, this also applies. Let's make it geopolitical again and talk about Eurasian connectivity. Your question there. Now, it's not about Eurasian consolidation into one power center in terms of control of the heartland, the way Mackinder would have described it more than a century ago. What I do advocate is two things, or what I observe is two things. One, Eurasian connectivity is growing. Again, that's a material fact of infrastructure of trade. Europe trades more with Asia than Europe trades with America. A lot more. $500 billion per year more. Even when your relations with China are bad, your trade is still strong with them and the rest of Asia as well. So Eurasian interdependence is growing, but that does not mean that there will be one power center. I believe, and this is something I do advocate for very strongly, I believe the future of Eurasia is multipolar, multiple core areas. Europe as a core area, Western Europe, Eastern Europe together, the European Union as a core area, China as a core area, India as a core area, Southeast Asia as a core area, the Gulf countries of West Asia as a core area. Eurasia's future is multipolar with multiple core zones, each of which has some degree of autonomy from the others, but has strong connectivity to the others. One of the fastest growing axes is, in fact, the Gulf countries and the Southeast Asian countries. The Gulf countries sell oil and gas. The Southeast Asian countries sell food, right? And they send workers as well. you have a very robust globalization going on between each of the power centers of Eurasia. So the future of Eurasia to me looks very clear. It will not be dominated by China. It will not be dominated by Russia. It will not be dominated by Europe, of course. It will not be dominated by anyone. And that is a beautiful thing. The preservation of Eurasian multipolarity should be the highest objective of geopolitics because it prevents the world from being dominated by any one power, even if there are systemically relevant superpowers like America, like China. And so the common pursuit, the American and the European agreement that there should be Eurasian multipolarity and the partnerships that now exist. Europe has its Eastern strategy, Asian strategy, and so forth, America as well. There's the Quad agreement with Asian powers, pushing all of these diplomatic agreements in the direction of diversifying power, diversifying investment away from concentration in China is very, very important. China will still be a superpower, but it will not be the sole power. So again, Eurasian multipolarity is the highest objective. And then the final couple of points to speak to Mr. Pavel's comments. I should have, just thank you for pointing out that the most fundamental accomplishment of connectivity is to improve lives for billions of people. So thank you for saying that. That is also an irrefutable fact. It is connectivity that has been uplifting in terms of expansion of trade, connectivity of supply chains, the flow of technology, all goods and services around the world that improve people's lives. And that is how China has become China, and India and Africans and others that have been elevated. It is through the force of connectivity. And I think that's worth reminding. Now, again, states never went away, and I never said that states would ever go away. I am a political geographer in my core, in my heart of hearts, right? So as I said at the very beginning, we have more states than ever before. If someone is talking about the disappearance of the state, it is not me, and I don't know who they are, but whoever they are, they do not know how to count. Because I count 200 states, and that's a lot of states, and it's a lot more than ever before. I do not have a problem with a world of many, many states at all. So, but the dynamic between states, and this is actually one of the core theses of the book, is that there is a paradox of what I call devolution and aggregation, right? The more states you have, the smaller each state is, and the more each state depends on neighbors for survival, right? And you see this happen everywhere in the world. You see this in Europe, of course. You see this in Southeast Asia. You see this in East Africa. You see this in Arab countries. Wherever you have fragmentation, you also have re-aggregation. That's why you have the European Union. The Balkan countries, which fought a bloody war of disintegration in the 1990s, now in very incremental ways are negotiating if they can have a customs union, right? In East African countries, they're saying, let's have a common currency, a common investment policy, and so forth. So you have devolution and splintering, but you have re-aggregation as well into larger regional commonwealths and units. So that to me is how states are actually behaving in reality. Russia is not behaving that way, but Russia is not representative of most states most of the time in most of the world, right? And I think it's important to make that distinction. You can have exceptions to the rule, but the behavior that I'm describing is very much the rule 99% of the time, 99 out of 100 years, at least as we head into this century. Now, final couple of points. So Pax Urbanica and what I call the new Middle Ages. The role of the state is simply that it is not the only actor. And that reminds me of the Middle Ages. And so I spend a lot of time in this book, Konektography, but also the precursor to that book, How to Run the World, was about the new Middle Ages. The new Middle Ages is this multi-level concept. You have global structures, some are supranational, some are just international and intergovernmental. You have regional commonwealths and institutions like the EU, and what I call the North American Union in this book, which is effectively what is happening, but it's not supranational. You have cities, and you have these transnational actors. Well, that is exactly what the Middle Ages was like: a multi-layered competitive system with these dynamics of cooperation and competition. So the world is connected, but it's not flat. Right? The world is thoroughly connected, but it's still very bumpy and aggregated. But when you say that there's concentration and risk of concentration, I disagree, because the world is more devolved than ever before. Again, 200 states and a multipolar order. Have we ever had a durable, globally distributed, multipolar order in world history? Never. So how can anyone say that we have excessive concentration? We have never had more devolution of power. North America represents about 25% of the world economy. Europe represents about 20% of the world economy. Asia represents about 45% of the world economy. Within Asia, you have China, Japan, India, ASEAN, Australia. You have never had a more distributed devolution of global power than we have today, ever, not even close. And when you talk about concentration of things like patents, for example, in certain cities. But if we go back 100 years, that concentration was far more extreme. 3 cities were responsible for much of the innovation in the world economy. Today, you have 15 cities that are saying that we are the Silicon Valley, we are the center of innovation. We are not a concentrated system. And most importantly, when it comes to the most fundamental attribute of global power, and when World War II ended, the United States represented 50% of the world economy, 50, right, in 1945. People say China is going to be the new superpower. How much of global GDP does China represent today? 15%, 15. And it will not climb much more, right? There is no way that the world is more concentrated than ever. We have never had a more entropic world than we have today. And entropy is very important. And if you recall in the book, I use a lot of physics analogies, right? When I'm explaining actually the logic of connectivity, I use physics all the time in the book. And entropy is one of the key concepts here, in a way. I like to think of this book as a book of geopolitical physics, really. And so entropy is deconcentration. And we are living in an age of deconcentration, where every country, every continent, in many cities, they are saying we want to be the center. We want to be a hub, right? We want to be call our own shots and be the boss. That is completely unique in history. And I don't think that countries will be forced to accept a supranational master or an imperial superpower. And that's why this entropy goes hand in hand with multipolarity. And all of the dynamics today of connectivity allow anyone to connect to anyone else without being stopped. You cannot be stopped from creating a trade agreement or a internet connection or a stock exchange relationship or an airline connection or a bilateral skills partnership of your professionals with another country. No one can really stop you. And that, again, is unique. So I'm a big believer in deconcentration, in entropy, because I believe that is how we maintain equilibrium in the system and we avoid the risk of excessive concentration of power. And that, again, should be the highest virtue.
Thanks, Parag, once again. Would you have time for one more question?
Sure. I just have a couple of minutes.
Great, because what you said, wealth is not flat. We will be living in a multipolar world. But what shocked me in your book, the one of the last chapters about moral compass, you write there about global harmonization, the process of global harmonization, but we are approaching about global morality. But in the same time, I think it's very, 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 very inspiring, this dilemma defined by Danny Roderick. He mentioned democracy, national sovereignty, and global economic integration. You cannot combine all of them. You need to choose. You are going toward global democratic system, or do you want to concentrate on national states and democracy? You cannot have all of them, three of these elements together. Will we have to choose globalization or democracy? In which direction does this moral compass show, in your opinion?
Right. That's a very good question. I like Danny Roderick. I like his work on globalization generally, but globalization is not about global democratization. So I do not believe that global democracy is a desirable or achievable objective. It's certainly not achievable, so it's hardly even worth discussing. No one said that you have to have global democracy as a result of globalization. My PhD supervisor at the London School of Economics was David Held, who passed away some years ago. And he was an advocate, a proponent of global democracy. He felt that you needed global democratic institutions to temper and to tame and to regulate and to embed the dynamics of globalization that could be exploited and increase inequality and so forth. And that is a noble objective, but it's not going to happen, right? So Roderick, though, spoke about domestic democracy because, of course, international forces can undermine democratic sovereign will. And that is true. That happens all the time. That's why, and in the more famous, or at least one of the best books ever written on the subject by Stephen Krasner, called Sovereignty, Organized Hypocrisy, he talks about how we talk about sovereignty, but in reality, we don't practice it because we are always undermining each other through foreign investment regulation in particular. And opening your borders to free trade and foreign investment requires massive compromises in sovereignty. And that's just one example of the erosion of sovereignty. And nationalism, we spoke earlier. If you hold nationalism, again, as a force that dictates that there is only one identity and one vision and one set of values in a country, well, that's certainly not true anymore either. So that also has been eroded. So you could say that democracy, nationalism, and sovereignty have all been eroded simultaneously by globalization. But perhaps to conclude, all that proves is my original point, which is that globalization always wins. I'm not saying that that's always a good thing. I am saying that it's true. And I think that it is irrefutably true. And in terms of global consciousness, the fact that we can speak, and in the sequel to this book, which is Move, my newest book, I spend more time on this because I look at generational change. And we have a young generation today that does subscribe to a common set of values. And I looked at the survey research from all over the world, and I saw that young people, generation millennials or generation Z, generation Alpha, they believe in the virtue of connectivity, of sustainability, of mobility. And these three things come up over and over and over. Chinese young people, African young people, Brazilian, American, these three words, I'm not making it up. This is not my opinion. This is the result of this research, demographic, sociological, psychological research done in every country in the world. Young people as a generation believe that there are global values, right? Sustainability, connectivity, mobility. These three things. And what's happening is that they have more in common with each other in terms of their consciousness, their values, their identity, than they have with their parents and their grandparents. So identity is no longer just vertical, it's also horizontal. And this is part of something that globalization has enabled. Is it definitive? No. Is it permanent? Not necessarily. Will it prevail over national identity? Not everywhere, not all the time. But is it new and is it different? And is it one competing force in this marketplace of identity and values? Yes, it is. And is it the result of globalization? Yes. And therefore, it is yet more evidence of the persistence and the penetration of globalization in so many different ways.
Thanks a lot once again,
Małgorzata,
Jacek, Piotr, because Parag needs to leave in a moment.
Thank you very much.
Short comment from your side to his words?
Well, from my side, it's only congratulations, and I just
Thank
hope to read your new book. And also, I also stress, I strongly believe, I wanted to mention this argument you mentioned that yes, with new generations, the world will be definitely different.
Yeah, my comment is that I expect many more tensions that Barak is expecting, apparently, because I think that the United States in the current structural situation will not give up, and that will call for the major attempt to deglobalize, though, because without it, the United States is going to lose the prevailing systemic position in the international system. And it's going to be very harsh. But I'm also not sure who's going to prevail. Parag is saying that globalization will prevail. I'm not so sure, but I hope Parag is right.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, everyone, so much. Oh, please go ahead.
Yes, my final comment, I definitely agree that we need to look at the data when we make our claims, and I definitely agree that all the data shows that the trade in goods is rebounding after the pandemics, and the trade in services is blooming right now. And frankly speaking, if we think about the limits for globalization, we mainly discuss political issues, political powers, or cultural issues. But we have to remember that probably the only limit to globalization right now, if we look at the services, is the limit of our technological capacity. And this technological capacity is still expanding. So this will definitely shape the future of globalization and globalization in services in the first place. So this would be the final remark from me. And once again, congratulations on book, and thanks for the discussion.
Thank you so much. Thank you all so much.
Thanks, Parag, for your time. Great, but you mentioned to connect with us from California, and we were able to talk about your book, to make all our comments and hear your words, important words about the changes of present world. Thanks a lot once again for your time.
Thank you, and I look forward to visiting you.
Konektografia in Polish.